The Mississippi Delta in 1868 was a land of heavy air and heavier memories. The Reconstruction era had draped a humid, fragile peace over the fields of cotton and the sluggish, muddy waterways. In the small, isolated town of Afton, nestled deep within the Delta, the stillness was often broken only by the chirping of cicadas and the distant, mournful whistle of a river steamer. Yet, it was the silence within the grand, decaying Crane Manor that truly stifled. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived in Afton under a sky the color of old pewter, threatening a downpour. A man of science and rational inquiry, his reputation as a meticulous investigator had reached even this remote corner of the South. His journey, requested via a series of increasingly desperate telegrams, was to examine a situation described vaguely, yet ominously, as a private, years-long affliction. The manor stood like a ghost of southern aristocracy, its white columns peeling, its veranda warped by relentless humidity. Alistair adjusted his spectacles, the damp air instantly fogging the lenses. He was greeted not by a servant, but by Mr. Thomas Crane, the master of the house, a man whose features were etched with a sorrow so deep it bordered on the grotesque. Thomas Crane's handshake was dry and trembling, and his eyes, a faded blue, held the glassy, unfocused look of someone perpetually staring at a hidden horror. "Dr. Finch, thank you for coming." Thomas's voice was a low, raspy whisper, like sand grating on wood. I warned you about the specifics. It is not a medical case in the traditional sense. It's a confinement. Alistair maintained a professional composure. "Mr. Crane, my understanding is that your daughter, Elizabeth, has been kept in a single room for the past 15 years. I am here to assess her condition, the environment, and determine what can be done to humanely resolve this confinement." Thomas led him through the house, a labyrinth of dim halls where the air was thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else. A faint, metallic odor Alistair couldn't quite place. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each sound an announcement in the pervasive silence. The furnishings were shrouded in white cloths, lending the house the look of a forgotten mausoleum. They stopped at the end of a second-floor hallway, before a solid, unvarnished cedar door, conspicuously newer than the rest of the house. There was no handle, only a heavy iron bolt set into the frame, secured from the outside with a substantial brass padlock. "This is it," Thomas breathed out, his hand hovering near the lock as if afraid to touch it. "Elizabeth's room. She was 7 when the incident occurred. She's 22 now." "The incident, Mr. Crane?" Alistair pressed gently. Thomas swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. "The tragedy. It's why we had to protect her, protect others." He paused, a long, agonizing silence stretching between them. "She hasn't seen the sun in 15 years. We pass food through a small, secured hatch at the bottom." Alistair knelt to examine the hatch. It was a small opening, barely enough for a plate, secured with a second bolt. Then his eyes were drawn to the cedar floor just beneath the hatch. The wood here was darker, not from age, but from a deep, almost black stain that had soaked into the grain. It was roughly circular, about a foot in diameter, and looked disturbingly like a dried pool of something. "What is this stain?" Alistair asked, his voice sharp with professional concern. Thomas flinched. "Old blood, Doctor. An accident years ago. She gets distressed sometimes." Alistair looked from the stain back to the unblinking, heavy door. The reality of the situation was settling over him. This was not a sanitarium case of delicate nerves, but a deliberate, long-term imprisonment. The atmosphere around the door was not just quiet. It was oppressively expectant, as if the wood itself were holding its breath. "I need to speak with her, Mr. Crane. I need to see her," Alistair stated firmly. Thomas fumbled with a ring of antique keys, his hands shaking so badly he had to try the brass key twice before it slid into the padlock. The click of the lock, followed by the heavy rasp of the bolt being drawn, was deafening in the silence. "Be cautious, Doctor," Thomas warned, his eyes wide and pleading. "She is volatile." unpredictable. He pulled the door inward slowly, revealing not a scream or a rush of frantic movement, but a heavy, almost dead silence. Alistair stepped into the room, Thomas remaining frozen in the doorway. The interior was small and spare, illuminated only by a high, grime-streaked window that let in a paltry grey light. There was a thin mattress on the floor in one corner, a chamber pot, and a few tattered pieces of cloth. The walls were bare, but the horror was not in the deprivation. It was in the room's sole occupant. Elizabeth Crane sat against the far wall. She was unnervingly still, a skeletal figure draped in a soiled cotton dress. Her hair was matted and long, obscuring much of her face. But when she slowly lifted her head, Alistair saw it. Her eyes, magnified by her emaciation, were huge, dark, and startlingly lucid. They did not hold the madness he might have expected, but a deep, chilling awareness. Alistair took a deliberate step toward her, his gaze sweeping the room. He needed to establish trust, to understand the psychological damage of 15 years of isolation. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice low and professional. "My name is Dr. Finch. I've come here to help you." Her reaction was slow. She tilted her head slightly, peering at him from behind the tangled curtain of her hair. Then she opened her mouth, not to scream, not to weep, but to deliver a single bone-chilling sentence that was utterly devoid of emotion. A cold, flat statement that contradicted everything Thomas Crane had claimed. "It's about time someone came for the others." The hairs on the back of Alistair's neck stood up. The others? He looked back at the terrified Thomas Crane in the doorway, then around the small, empty room. The sense of foreboding tightened into a knot of immediate suspense and deep mystery. He had expected a victim of psychological decay. Instead, he had found an alert, frighteningly composed prisoner who implied that her horrific confinement was not the whole story. The stain on the cedar floor now felt less like a relic of an accident and more like a signpost of a hidden tragedy, a secret that had been locked away alongside Elizabeth for 15 years. The true horror, Alistair realized, was just beginning to reveal itself. This is only the beginning of the horrifying case of Elizabeth Crane. To uncover the sinister secrets of the Crane family and learn who the others are, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next chapter of this deep dive into psychological terror and mystery will be released soon. Alistair Finch's scientific training warred with the primal sense of dread he felt. He had entered a prison, but the prisoner spoke of others, turning a case of supposed psychological illness into a deeper mystery. "Elizabeth, who are the others?" Alistair asked, keeping his tone measured and calm. He watched Thomas Crane flinch in the doorway, his face pale and slack. Elizabeth didn't move her body, but her intense, focused gaze shifted to a spot on the wall behind Alistair, then back to the doctor. "They were here. Before. They didn't leave properly." Her voice was a dry, unused instrument, each word a slow, careful rasp. Thomas stepped forward, his whisper urgent and desperate. "Don't listen to her, doctor. It's the delusion. Years of isolation, it does this. The others are phantom playmates, imaginations." Alistair raised a hand, stopping Thomas. He knelt, positioning himself slightly below Elizabeth's level, projecting non-threat. "I am a doctor, Elizabeth. I only want the truth. Tell me about the others. Are they family? Servants?" She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "They were Thomas's mistake, and Mama's tears." Alistair felt a prickle of unease. Her words, though fragmented, carried a heavy, grounded meaning. He glanced at Thomas, whose panic was now a tangible thing, his eyes darting between Elizabeth and the hallway. "Mr. Crane, I need a word with you. Outside. Now," Alistair commanded, his voice firm. Once the heavy door was shut and the bolts reluctantly replaced by Thomas, Alistair turned on the man, his earlier deference gone. "Mr. Crane, your daughter is not merely mad. She is starved, isolated, and seems to be protecting a secret. The stain on that floor, you said it was old blood from an accident. The truth, sir. Tell me about the tragedy 15 years ago." Thomas leaned against the wall, the effort of standing appearing immense. "It was our cook, Doctor. A young woman named Clara. She fell down the stairs. A horrible accident. Elizabeth was close to her, saw it. It broke her mind. That's when the delusions started, the shouting, the violence. We had to keep her safe. She said, Mama's tears." "Where is Mrs. Crane?" Elizabeth mentioned her. A new, deeper shadow crossed Thomas's face. "My wife, Lydia. She couldn't bear it. The war, the decline of the estate, and then Elizabeth's condition. She took to her bed years ago, a profound melancholy. She never leaves her room on the ground floor. It broke her spirit." Alistair considered this. The master of the house was a wreck of guilt and fear, the daughter an imprisoned mystery, and the mother an invalid, a recluse in her own home. The house was not just physically decaying, its inhabitants were spiritually shattered. "I need to speak with Mrs. Crane," Alistair stated. "If Elizabeth's trauma is rooted in the events of 15 years ago, her mother's perspective is vital." Thomas hesitated, a desperate plea in his eyes. "She won't speak. She hasn't spoken a complete sentence in years. She just cries. But if you must." The journey to Lydia Crane's room on the ground floor was like descending into another layer of hell. The room was dark, the heavy velvet drapes permanently drawn. The air was sickly sweet, perfumed with lavender and the stale scent of sickness. Lydia Crane lay in a vast four-poster bed. She was not emaciated like Elizabeth, but heavy-set, almost buried in the linens, her face round and pale as a marble statue. She stared blankly at the ceiling, her eyes red-rimmed and perpetually wet. Alistair sat beside the bed. "Mrs. Crane, my name is Dr. Finch. I am here to help Elizabeth. Your daughter mentioned the others and she mentioned your tears. Please, I need to know what happened 15 years ago with the cook, Clara." Lydia's breathing hitched. A single, silent tear tracked a slow path down her temple into the pillow. Her lips moved, a faint, almost silent whisper escaping. The noise. It wasn't the fall. Alistair leaned in, urging her on. "What was it, Mrs. Crane? What was the noise?" Her eyes shifted, slowly, painfully, locking onto Alistair's. They held not the blankness of melancholia, but a sudden terrifying flash of fear, a fear that momentarily eclipsed her sorrow. She heard it. Elizabeth saw. Thomas said. He said she was too young to understand the sacrifice. Sacrifice. The word hung in the air, a chilling replacement for accident. It suggested deliberation, a calculated act, not a tragic mishap. Alistair glanced at Thomas, who stood rigid in the shadows near the door, his jaw clenched, his composure dangerously thin. "What sacrifice, Mrs. Crane? Who was sacrificed?" Alistair pushed. Lydia's eyes rolled back to the ceiling, the fear subsiding back into the safe fog of despair. She made a faint, guttural sound. And then, slowly, she raised her right hand, her fingers gnarled and trembling. She pointed, not at the wall or a window, but down toward the floorboards. Alistair followed the direction of her gaze, his mind racing. The stain upstairs, the hidden history. Elizabeth was locked away on the second floor. Clara, the cook, supposedly fell down the main staircase. Why would the mother point to the floor of her own room on the ground level, using the word sacrifice? The house was not just holding one prisoner. It was concealing multiple layers of a deeply human and chilling crime, buried under the facade of Southern tragedy and mental illness. The silence of the mother, the fear of the father, and the strange lucidity of the daughter had painted a picture far darker than any simple delusion. Alistair felt the cold, damp dread of the Delta air settling deep in his bones, realizing the true horror of the Crane Manor was not a ghost story, but a locked, festering human secret. Alistair Finch returned to Elizabeth's door, the knowledge of Lydia Crane's desperate silence weighing heavily on him. He knew he was no longer dealing with simple trauma. He was in the heart of a concealed conspiracy. Thomas Crane trailed him, his nervous energy a palpable tremor in the air. "Mr. Crane," Alistair said, stopping Thomas before he could bolt the door again. "Your wife used the word sacrifice. And the stain on the floor upstairs. It looks to be where someone bled out, not a simple kitchen injury. Thomas wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his composure finally starting to crumble. You are jumping to conclusions, Doctor. The strain of the past few years has affected Lydia's mind. She speaks nonsense. She has no idea what she's saying. The strain, Mr. Crane, seems to be a shared affliction, Alistair countered, his gaze unwavering. Where is the staircase where Clara supposedly fell? I need to inspect the scene of the accident. Thomas hesitated, but the authority in Alistair's voice, the authority of a rational man challenging a decade and a half of hidden irrationality, was enough. He reluctantly led Alistair to the main stairwell, a grand mahogany structure in the central foyer. Alistair moved slowly, his mind a steel trap of observation. He examined the wood, running his gloved hand over the banister. There were no marks, no gouges, nothing to suggest a violent, tumbling fall. The steps were solid. It's here, Thomas muttered, pointing vaguely toward the bottom. She was carrying a heavy load of laundry. She slipped. Alistair knelt. If she slipped, where are the repairs? A fall heavy enough to kill someone would certainly damage the woodwork. The stairs here are intact, polished and old. No evidence of recent repair. Thomas's face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. We hired a craftsman from Baton Rouge, did a very thorough job. Replaced the entire bottom section. You wouldn't know. An entire section, Mr. Crane. Why replace a whole section for a fall? Alistair pushed. Where are the replacement stairs now? Lumber is valuable. The lie caught in Thomas's throat. He looked away, out the tall, dust-filmed windows toward the oppressive humidity of the delta. I burned them. I wanted no reminder of the tragedy. Alistair stood, his professional veneer cracking to reveal controlled fury. Mr. Crane, a life was lost, and your daughter has been locked in a room for 15 years. You cannot expect a man of science to believe a story of burned evidence and coincidentally perfect repairs. The mystery here is less about Elizabeth's mind and more about your actions. Alistair turned his attention back to the room. He walked away from the main stairwell and toward the ground floor room where Lydia lay. He walked past it, seeking any other entrance or exit to Elizabeth's chamber above, or any room directly beneath it. He found a small, locked storage closet directly below Elizabeth's room, near the back wall of the house. What is in here, Mr. Crane? Old linens, winter things, nothing of consequence. Thomas quickly dismissed, moving to block the door. Alistair put a hand on Thomas's shoulder, exerting a surprising firm pressure. Mr. Crane, if you wish me to help Elizabeth, you must stop obstructing my investigation. I am not a constable, but I can assure you, the moment I am convinced of a criminal act, I will ride to the nearest sheriff. Thomas paled. The threat of legal intrusion in the chaos of the Reconstruction South, where justice was fickle and reputation was everything, proving too much. He fumbled again for the keys. The closet was narrow, deep and dry. It smelled of cedar and mothballs. But Alistair's eyes went immediately to the ceiling of the closet, the floor of Elizabeth's room. The planking was tight, but in one area directly above the black stain on the cedar floor of Elizabeth's room, Alistair noticed a minute seam. It was barely visible, running alongside a floor joist, almost perfectly concealed. He pressed on the wood. It was slightly yielding. Alistair retrieved a small, sharp instrument from his doctor's bag, a dissecting scalpel. He carefully inserted the blade into the seam and slowly, meticulously, began to pry. As the wood separated, a faint, earthy and sickening sweet odor drifted down. The metallic scent Alistair had noticed earlier in the house, now concentrated and overpowering. It was the smell of decay, not of food or old linen. He managed to loosen a single floorboard in the ceiling of the closet. He reached up, his fingers searching the cavity, the darkness absolute. His hand closed around something small and slick. He pulled it out, dropping it onto the dusty floor of the closet. It was a child's toy, a crude wooden doll, its face smeared with a dark, dried substance. But that was not all. With a grunt of effort, he managed to pull the floorboard out entirely. The gap revealed a dusty, black space between the joists. Alistair held his lantern up, illuminating the cavity. There, nestled in the dark space, were more objects. A woman's hair comb, made of ivory, a man's cufflink, tarnished brass, and then a small, worn leather Bible. But the most disturbing discovery was the sight of the subflooring beneath. In a central patch, the wood was saturated, not only with the black stain he had seen above, but also permeated by a sticky, dark residue that had dripped and dried over the joists. This residue was clearly not from a single small wound. It suggested a protracted, brutal draining, all focused on this one terrible spot. Alistair looked down at the brass cufflink he'd retrieved. He turned to Thomas Crane, who stood frozen in the doorway, watching the scene with the horror of a man whose deepest secret has been unearthed. The cook, Clara, Mr. Crane, Alistair's voice was low, lethal, and the others. What man in your position wears brass cufflinks when the rest of your home is filled with fine silver and mahogany? This is not your property, and this room, sir, is not a sanitarium. He looked back at the void above, the cavity connecting Elizabeth's prison to the dark secret below. The realization hit him with the force of a blow. Elizabeth had not been kept from the world because of her breakdown. She had been locked in a room to ensure a horrible truth, and the evidence of a crime stayed contained. The isolation was a calculated form of psychological torture meant to conceal a far greater, deeply human atrocity that was still waiting to be fully exposed. The doll, the comb, the cufflink, they were remnants of the others Elizabeth spoke of, implying a grim fate far worse than a fall down a set of stairs. The discovery of the artifacts beneath the floorboard confirmed Alistair's worst fears. Elizabeth was not a mad girl imprisoned for her own good, but a crucial witness locked away to silence her. The others were real, and their fate had been brutally sealed in that small upstairs room 15 years prior. The metallic residue and the objects themselves pointed toward a sustained, horrific event. Alistair stepped out of the closet, the small Bible in his hand, the evidence of its contents still obscured by dust and dried grime. Thomas Crane, leaning heavily against the wall, had lost all semblance of authority. He was a ruined man, his terror a clear admission of guilt. "The police, Mr. Crane, I will summon them now," Alistair said, his voice calm yet resolute. "Unless you tell me everything. Now. The full truth." Thomas slid down the wall, sinking to the floor, his head bowed. The sound that came from him was not a cry, but a desolate, dry rattling. "They'll hang me. They'll ruin the family name." "Your family name is already stained, sir," Alistair retorted, pointing to the ceiling. "Your daughter has paid the price for your secrets for 15 years. Alistair opened the small leather Bible. It was not a Bible at all, but a disguised miniature diary. The paper inside was brittle and yellowed, the ink faded, written in a child's careful script. He read the first entry he could decipher, dated 16 years ago, 1 year before Elizabeth's confinement began. "Papa is angry a lot now. He says the war ruined everything. He yells at Mama for selling her jewels. He yells at Mr. Elias for his prices. Mr. Elias came for the money again. Papa hid. Cook Clara let him in anyway. She said he's a kind man, always polite. Papa found out. He hit her. I hid in the pantry and cried." Alistair's eyes widened. Mr. Elias, a name, a real person, likely the owner of the brass cufflink. He was not a phantom, but a victim. He skipped forward in the diary, searching for the tragedy. The entries became sparse, then frantic, an entry from 15 years and 1 month ago. "The man is staying in the servant's house now. Papa says he is a new field hand, but he has nice clothes and his hands are soft. He talks to Clara. Mama worries. The debt is too big. Papa says he'll take care of it." Then, the final, chilling entry, dated the day of the alleged accident, 15 years ago. I shouldn't have been there. I was hiding in the linen closet above the pantry. I saw them go into the upper storage room, the one right next to my bedroom now. Clara and Mr. Elias. They were talking low. Then Papa came with the lantern, not yelling, just quiet. He locked the outer door. I heard the scuffle, a fall, but not down the stairs. I heard digging and a lot of awful, wet sounds. And then the smell. And I heard Thomas say to Mama, "The debt is paid, Lydia. The mistake is gone. Now we secure the witness." Alistair looked at the weeping Thomas Crane on the floor, the truth as clear and brutal as the delta sun that occasionally broke through the clouds. Thomas Crane, financially ruined by the war and crippling debt, had murdered the man to whom he owed money, Mr. Elias, and had been aided by the cook, Clara. Elizabeth was not psychologically damaged by seeing an accident, but by witnessing a double murder and the subsequent gruesome concealment. Clara was the one who fell, Mr. Crane, down the stairs, Alistair stated, testing him. Thomas shook his head weakly, tears finally falling, washing streaks through the dust on his face. No, doctor. Elias was first. In the storage room. That was the wet sounds. He was going to expose me to the authorities. The debt was too much. We wrestled. I hit him with the poker. Clara, she saw it all. She tried to run. She was going to tell. I couldn't let her. Not after Elias. It was too late. I chased her up to the second floor, into that storage room. My room now. He pointed toward Elizabeth's chamber. You killed them both, Alistair whispered, sickened. And then what? We moved Elias's body into the floor cavity. We drained the blood. That's the stain Elizabeth stares at. We disposed of Clara's body later, out in the swamps. The accident on the stairs was the cover story. But Elizabeth, she was hiding. She saw and heard it all, and she started screaming the names, Elias and Clara. We had to silence her, not because she was mad, but because she knew. The house, Alistair realized, was not a mere prison, but a meticulously constructed tomb and a monument to murder. The new cedar door, the bolts, the padlocks, all were instruments not of care, but of containment and absolute psychological control. Thomas Crane had successfully gaslighted the entire town, convincing them his daughter had gone mad after a tragic accident. Alistair's resolve hardened. He had the names and the motive, but the story was not complete. You said you secured the witness, Mr. Crane, but Elizabeth spoke of the others and of being here to come for them. Her lucidity is not what I expected from 15 years of isolation and trauma. If she witnessed such horror, why is she not completely broken? Thomas looked up, his eyes now wide with a terror that surpassed the fear of the gallows. Because, Doctor, she was only 7, but she didn't just watch. When Clara tried to run, Elizabeth, she was hiding with an old length of rope, a childish game. She tripped her. Just a foot, but it was enough to send Clara stumbling into the storage room, right where I could catch her. She wasn't just a witness. She was the one who delivered the final, fatal mistake. Alistair looked down at the child's handwriting in the diary. I shouldn't have been there. The truth was a spiraling horror. Elizabeth was an accessory to the murder of the one person who showed her kindness, forced into a pact of silence, and then locked away by the man who had coerced her complicity. Her confinement was the result of a terrifying form of parental emotional blackmail, a life sentence of guilt and terror more powerful than any physical lock. This was the psychological terror that had sustained her lucidity, the burden of her own participation in the crime, and the desperate, adult-like need to rationalize her father's ultimate act of securing the witness. The chilling revelation of Elizabeth's inadvertent complicity in Clara's death reframed the entire case. Her confinement was not just a means of silencing a witness, but a tool of relentless psychological manipulation and guilt. Thomas Crane, having destroyed his own financial life, had now destroyed his daughter's life and soul. Alistair rose, placing the diary carefully back into his medical bag. The time for a rational discussion was over. He needed to extract Elizabeth immediately, not just for her physical well-being, but to break the decades-long cycle of terror and lies. "Mr. Crane, get up," Alistair commanded. "You are coming with me. We are going to a place where you can confess your crimes to the authorities." Thomas remained on the floor, suddenly defiant, not out of strength, but out of absolute, terrified resignation. "No, I won't leave. If I leave, Lydia will be alone. She doesn't speak, but she knows the secret. The whole house is the secret, Doctor. I built it to keep the silence." Alistair understood. For Thomas, leaving the manor meant the collapse of his entire, carefully constructed psychological reality. The house was his safe harbor, his tomb of secrets. "Then I will summon the sheriff here," Alistair said, moving toward the front door. As he reached the foyer, he stopped. The oppressive silence of the house was now punctuated by a new sound, a low, persistent scraping coming from Elizabeth's room upstairs. "What is that?" Alistair demanded, turning sharply toward Thomas. Thomas, still huddled on the floor, didn't need to look up. "That is Elizabeth. The scratching. She does that when she's active, when the memories are close. She's scratching at the floor." Alistair rushed back up the stairs. The sound was distinct now, a steady, rhythmic rasping of something hard against the wood directly over the spot of the bloody stain. The psychological tension ratcheted up instantly. Elizabeth was digging at the very foundation of Thomas Crane's secret. He reached the door and fumbled with the keys, his hands for the first time betraying a slight tremor. He unlocked the heavy brass padlock and drew the bolt, throwing the door open. Elizabeth was no longer sitting against the wall. She was on her hands and knees by the hatch, using a shard of ceramic, broken from the base of her chamber pot, to slowly and methodically scrape the stain on the cedar floor. She was not frantic. She was meticulous, as though performing a grim ritual. She stopped when the light hit her, her head tilting, the matted hair falling back. The eyes that met Alistair's were focused, but with an unsettling, blank intensity. "Elizabeth, stop that," Alistair said, moving toward her. She ignored him, bringing the ceramic shard down again, a thin line of splintered wood appearing. "It bleeds," she rasped. "Always bleeds. When the rain is hard, it bleeds into the ground, where Thomas put them." Alistair saw the floorboards around the stain were now deeply scored and scratched, the surface layer worn away in a disturbing, repetitive pattern. The dark stain was not just on the surface, it had clearly saturated deep into the wood fibers. "Elizabeth, I know what happened. I know about Elias and Clara, and I know your father made you watch. You are not to blame." Her scraping stopped. She let the shard fall, her gaze dropping to the dark wood. She raised her fingers and rubbed them across the stain, then held them up, though there was no fresh blood. "The lie," she whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. "The lie is that Papa locked me in. He bolted the door from the outside, but I was the one who told him where the key was hidden. He took it from the mantel. I helped him." This new layer of complexity struck Alistair hard. She had not only aided in the final moments of Clara's death, but had actively participated in her own initial confinement, sealing the secret along with herself. This was the ultimate psychological mechanism of guilt, self-punishment, and self-containment. "Why, Elizabeth? Why help him lock you in?" "Because of the noise," she said, her large eyes looking past Alistair at the wall. The noise was worse than the smell. It was the noise they made when they tried to get out. "It came up through the floor. I thought if the walls were thick and the door was solid, I could stop hearing it. It was the only way to make the guilt stop." The digging, Thomas confessed to, was the hasty burial of Elias beneath the floor. Elizabeth, the 7-year-old child, had been so traumatized by the sights and the sounds of the struggle and the subsequent burial directly beneath her bed that she had chosen total isolation as a coping mechanism against the sound of her own internal guilt and the physical truth of the crime beneath her. She had been locked away for 15 years, not by force, but by her own crushing, paralyzing sense of responsibility. Alistair felt a profound pity and terror. This was not a story of the supernatural. but of a monstrous human pathology. He reached out a hand to her. "Elizabeth, I'm taking you out of this room. You're coming with me. You don't have to carry this burden anymore." Her intense gaze shifted back to him. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she pointed a bony finger toward the far, high window. "The sun," she said, a strange, strained excitement in her voice. "It hasn't been blocked in a long time. They're coming back, Doctor. I know it. They are coming for Thomas first, and then they're coming for the final witness." Alistair followed her gaze to the window. The high window, always streaked with grime, was now letting in a sudden, brilliant, blinding shaft of sun. The storm clouds had finally broken. But what Elizabeth pointed at was not the sun. It was the iron bars of the window itself, which, in the sudden light, cast long, perfectly straight, symmetrical shadows down the wall and across the bare floor. The confinement was real, but the deepest, most terrifying lock was her own mind, still grappling with the inevitable return of the truth she helped bury. Alistair's priority shifted from investigation to extraction. The mental and emotional state of Elizabeth was too fragile to endure any further confrontation with her father. The mention of the sun not being blocked and the fear of the final witness suggested a break in her carefully constructed internal defenses. A final, terrifying reckoning was approaching for the entire Crane family. He had Thomas Crane handcuffed loosely to the banister downstairs, using his own medical restraints, and informed him that the sheriff was on his way. The lie provided a necessary, temporary compliance. Alistair re-entered Elizabeth's room. She was back in the corner, holding the small, crude ceramic shard like a weapon or a talisman. "Elizabeth, I am going to open the front door. You will walk out of this house with me into the sunlight. You need fresh air." "The air is full of it," she countered, her eyes wild. "The smell. It comes from the ground. They are close." Alistair recalled Thomas's confession. Clara's body was disposed of in the swamps. The decaying smell of the humid delta and the pervasive metallic odor in the house likely blurred in Elizabeth's mind, making her perceive the entire outdoors as contaminated by her father's crime. "We need to leave, Elizabeth. We need to go outside so I can finally tell the story of Elias and Clara and clear your name." Her head snapped up. My name is guilt. He said I had to earn my quiet by staying in the room. But sometimes, when I was small, I saw things. Heard things outside the window." "What did you see?" "The gardener, Silas. He was always working, always digging. He never looked up at the window. He was one of the others in the beginning. He saw it too, but he got his silence. I didn't." Alistair paused, a fresh wave of suspicion washing over him. Another witness? And why would Silas be digging around the property if he knew bodies were buried there? The crime was more complex, the chain of complicity longer. Alistair left Elizabeth, secure in her self-imposed corner, and hurried back downstairs. Thomas Crane was slumped, defeated, against the banister. "The gardener, Mr. Crane. Silas, your daughter says he was another witness." Thomas swallowed, his eyes darting. "Silas? No. He's been with the family for 20 years. A loyal, simple man. He knows nothing. But he was here 15 years ago. Yes, of course. Worked the fields, tended the grounds." Alistair went out onto the sweltering veranda. The sun had indeed broken through, casting hard shadows. He saw an old black man tending a small, overgrown patch of rose bushes near the south wall, which was closest to the room directly beneath Elizabeth's. The man was thin, with hands like knotted wood, his concentration absolute. This must be Silas. Alistair approached him, his tone respectful. "Silas, I am Dr. Finch. I am here to help Miss Elizabeth." Silas didn't look up, continuing to prune the dead wood. "Miss Elizabeth ain't sick, Doctor, just shut in. Been so a long time." His voice was deep, slow and non-committal, typical of the weary reserve of the Delta post-war era. "She speaks of Elias and Clara. She says you were a witness to what happened 15 years ago." Silas stopped, the clippers in his hand freezing. The air felt suddenly thicker, heavier than the humidity. He slowly looked up, his eyes ancient and knowing. "Miss Elizabeth talks things. Imagination of a child, trapped," Silas said, carefully choosing his words. "She also says you were always digging around the foundation, near the south wall." Silas finally stood up straight, wiping his hands on his worn overalls. He looked directly at Alistair, his expression one of profound, resigned sorrow. "I dig, Doctor, because Mr. Thomas makes me. He dug his hole, and he made me dig a new one, every year, a little deeper, to try and cover the smell of the first one." Alistair felt a tremor of revulsion. Thomas Crane had not merely buried Elias in a floor cavity, he had then forced his gardener, a man who was likely terrified to speak out in the tumultuous Reconstruction South, to constantly work the soil outside the room, hoping the fresh earth and the planting of new roots would suppress the stench of decay. Silas was not a co-conspirator. He was an unwilling caretaker of the crime scene. "Where did the smell come from, Silas?" "The floor cavity is small." Silas lowered his voice. "When Mr. Thomas buried Mr. Elias, he didn't wrap him proper, just put him down there in the dirt under the planks. The heat and the damp, it does things. He put lye and earth, but it don't stop. It seeps into the wood, like the doctor saw. The smell, it was so bad, Mr. Thomas couldn't sleep. He made me dig a small trench right outside that wall and fill it with charcoal, earth and lime, over and over. A fresh cover. He didn't want the smell to reach the river, Doctor. He was afraid the river will tell the secret." Alistair looked from Silas to the house. The grand, decaying Crane Manor was not just a home, but a vast, ongoing concealment operation, with Thomas Crane as the frantic conductor and Silas as the silent, traumatized laborer. The smell that Elizabeth feared was the physical proof of her guilt, the constant reminder that the earth itself was trying to reject the terrible act done to it. Silas leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Thomas told me one night, when he was drunk and weeping, that he didn't just put Mr. Elias in the cavity. He said he had to make sure he was dead. Used a heavy, rusty old lock to crush his throat. That's why he changed the door upstairs, Doctor. He didn't want Miss Elizabeth to see the same kind of lock on her door that he used to kill Mr. Elias." Alistair's blood ran cold. The brass padlock on Elizabeth's door was not a symbol of security, but a direct, sick trophy of murder, its purpose mirrored in the instrument of Elias's death. Thomas had created a prison whose very structure was a reminder of the crime, a psychological torment for the girl he meant to silence. The key that Elizabeth had given him to secure her confinement was a key not just to a door, but to her own self-destruction. The new information from Silas, the constant digging, the use of a lock in the murder, and the pervasive odor did not relieve Elizabeth's guilt, but deepened the horror of Thomas Crane's pathological control. Alistair realized the manor itself was an echo chamber of trauma, each detail designed to perpetuate the psychological agony of the victims. He had to act fast, as the mounting pressure was on the verge of shattering Thomas Crane entirely. Alistair returned inside, finding Thomas still slumped by the banister, his breathing shallow. He looked utterly drained. "The sheriff is riding here now, Mr. Crane." Alistair lied again, his voice carrying the finality of a judgment. "I know about Silas. I know about the annual digging, and I know about the lock you used on Elias." Thomas shuddered violently, his eyes opening wide and terrified. He looked up at Alistair, not as a doctor but as an inescapable judge. "The lock, the key, it's all connected. She knows the connections. The connections are what keeps her quiet." "What connections?" "The debt, Doctor. It was everything. My grandfather's land, my father's name. Elias was going to take it all. I had to protect what was mine." Thomas lifted his head, a flash of the old, arrogant Southern master briefly returning. "But Elizabeth, she has my mind. She understood. Not the money, but the protection. She wasn't protecting your name, Mr. Crane. She was protecting herself from the sound of the dead, from the shame of her own action." Alistair corrected, his voice firm. "You manipulated a 7-year-old child to lock herself in a room for 15 years. That is a cruelty worse than the murder itself." Thomas's eyes darted past Alistair to the dark hallway. No, I protected her from the inevitable consequence. She was never going to be normal again. The world would demand answers. The room made the consequences stop. Alistair knew he needed one final piece of evidence to ensure Thomas's confession was absolute and legally sound. To finally free Elizabeth not just from the room, but from the legal and psychological shadow of her father. He needed the murder weapon, the lock Thomas had confessed to using. "Where is the lock, Mr. Crane?" "The one you used on Elias." Thomas laughed, a dry, horrific sound. "You think I would keep it, Doctor? A relic of that night? No, it's gone. Lost." Alistair thought back to Elizabeth's diary, to her intense focus on the dark stain and her meticulous scraping. He recalled her words. "The lie is that Papa locked me in. He bolted the door from the outside, but I was the one who told him where the key was hidden." Alistair realized the key to Elizabeth's freedom and the evidence of the crime must be something she still possessed, something that was a constant reminder of her choice to comply. He rushed back upstairs to Elizabeth's room. She hadn't moved. The shard was back on the floor. "Elizabeth, I am going to ask you about the lock, the one your father used. Do you know where it is?" She nodded slowly. "It's gone. Thomas threw it down the well in the yard. But the key, I have the key. The key to the lock he used to kill Elias." She shook her head, her matted hair swaying slightly. "No, the key to this door. My door. The one I told him to take from the mantel. The one he used to put the bolts on." This was a psychological breakthrough. The brass padlock's key was the symbol of her own, conscious compliance in her confinement. "Where is it, Elizabeth?" She raised her left hand, which she had kept hidden beneath her tattered skirt. Her fingers, long and thin, slowly uncurled, revealing a small tarnished brass key attached to a thin, frayed piece of twine. It was the key to the heavy padlock on her door. "It never left me," she whispered. "I kept it so I could check the bolt myself, to make sure Thomas did it right, to make sure the noise wouldn't get out." Alistair felt a deep surge of pity. She had kept her own key, not to escape, but to ensure her imprisonment was secure, a final terrifying act of self-imposed justice. "Elizabeth, I need you to give me that key. I want you to unlock your silence." She held the key out to him. As Alistair reached for it, she spoke, her voice flat and cold, utterly devoid of her earlier panic. "The man in the well. Elias. He has the lock, the rusty one. It wasn't thrown in the well, it was dropped, and he's holding it." Alistair froze. Thomas said he threw the lock in the well. Elizabeth said he dropped it, and Elias was holding it. He looked from the key to the girl. This was the final terrifying piece of the puzzle. Thomas Crane had not just killed Elias. He had disposed of the body in the floor cavity, but before doing so, he had placed the murder weapon, the lock, in the dead man's hand, in a final grotesque act of framing the victim for his own end, or simply to rid himself of the physical burden of the object, only for the child to see it. Elizabeth's mind had transformed this memory into a horrific psychological certainty that the victim was still holding the truth, waiting to be found. Alistair took the key. This was the moment of truth. He had to trust Elizabeth's fragmented, traumatized memory over Thomas Crane's obvious lies. The well was the last piece of evidence. Armed with Elizabeth's revelation about the lock and the well, Alistair Finch now moved with a purpose born of desperate necessity. The Reconstruction era meant a long ride to the nearest legitimate sheriff. He had to secure the final piece of evidence himself. He bound Thomas Crane's wrists more securely to the banister. "I am going to the well, Mr. Crane. If you tell me the truth about the lock and Elias now, I will ensure your family's distress is handled with a modicum of discretion." Thomas Crane only shook his head. His tears dried, replaced by a vacant stare of total defeat. "It's too late, Doctor. It's all in the ground. The earth has the last word." Alistair took his lantern and his coil of thin rope, hurrying out into the yard. Silas was gone, having slipped away in the silence. The manor's well was an old stone structure, moss-covered and deep, located near the corner of the house closest to Elizabeth's room. He secured the lantern to the rope and lowered it slowly into the shaft. The stone walls disappeared into the gloom. The air coming back up was cold and smelled of mineral water and deep earth. The light finally hit the water far below. It was a murky black surface, reflecting the beam like a disturbed eye. He couldn't see anything. Alistair then retrieved a sturdy iron grappling hook from Silas's neglected tool shed, a necessity in a region defined by its water and swamps. He tied it to a heavier rope and began lowering it into the well. The first few attempts yielded nothing but stones and damp, clinging moss. The silence of the afternoon was broken only by the clank of the hook against the wet stone and the creak of the rope. On the 8th pull, the rope grew heavy, taut. Alistair hauled on it, his shoulders aching, the sweat beading on his brow in the humid air. The sheer weight suggested something substantial, something far heavier than Thomas Crane's lost old lock. Slowly, painstakingly, a dark, dripping bundle emerged from the well's mouth. Alistair pulled it clear and dropped it onto the rough, wet ground. It was a waterlogged burlap sack, heavily weighted, tied tightly with a thick, mouldy piece of twine. The sack had clearly been submerged for years. The smell that immediately wafted from it was not the fresh decay of the earth, but a profound, preserved stench of damp rot and putrefaction. Alistair took his knife and carefully slit the thick sack open. The contents spilled out onto the earth. There was a pile of heavy, river-worn stones used as ballast, and then the objects that confirmed Elizabeth's fragmented, terrified memory. There was a collection of old iron and brass locks, rusted and fused together from years of submersion. There were 5 of them in total. 2 padlocks, 2 hasps, and 1 heavy, old-fashioned door lock, its mechanism frozen solid with rust. Alistair knelt, examining the heavy door lock. It was substantial, big enough to be used as a blunt instrument. As he scraped away the thick residue of iron oxide and silt, he noticed a deep gouge in the brass casing, a heavy impact mark. This was likely the very object Thomas Crane had used to crush Elias. But that was not the most horrifying discovery. Among the locks and stones, there were small, smooth bone fragments, bleached white by the water and the chemical process of decay. They were tiny, delicate, unmistakably the bones of a small animal, or perhaps even a child. Alistair's mind flashed back to Elizabeth's words. It's about time someone came for the others. He realized the full, monstrous scale of Thomas Crane's actions. The original crime was the murder of Elias and Clara, witnessed and then helped by Elizabeth. But the others Elizabeth spoke of may not have been only Elias and Clara. He looked closer at the small bones. They seemed too small and fragmented to be human, perhaps a chicken or a rabbit used to bait a trap, tossed into the well. But then he spotted a small, dark object fused to the side of the heavy door lock. A small, dark, charred piece of cloth. He pulled it free with the knife tip. It was a fragment of a child's doll dress, identical in color and fabric to the remnants of the wooden doll found beneath the floorboards of Elizabeth's room. Elizabeth had not only suffered the trauma of witnessing murder and helping to bury it, Thomas Crane had performed an elaborate, continuous psychological campaign to keep her paralyzed by fear. He hadn't just used the lock to kill Elias. He had repeatedly planted fragments of evidence, the doll, the keys, the lock, as physical reminders of her complicity and the horror, ensuring that her mind never found peace. The small bones and the doll cloth pointed to one thing: a deep-seated fear that the crime would rise from the depths. Thomas Crane had not thrown the locks into the well to dispose of them. He had tied them in a sack to the remains of evidence, the small bones, the doll fragments, and thrown them in to contaminate the water source of the house. He had poisoned his own home, making Elizabeth feel that the very water she drank was a constant, physical intake of the horror she had helped create. Alistair looked back at the house, a towering symbol of southern decay and human evil. The crime was a cycle of terror. He had the weapon. He had the confession from the diary. He had the witness. He secured the sack of evidence, his hands trembling. He had to confront Thomas Crane one last time, not for a confession, but for the full scope of his sick, years-long operation of psychological terror and moral destruction. The weight of the sack was nothing compared to the weight of the man's crime. Alistair Finch returned to the manor, the heavy, dripping sack of evidence his proof. He had the key, the diary, Silas's testimony, and the sack containing the murder lock and the chilling fragment of the doll's dress. He had all he needed to bring the full truth to the authorities. Thomas Crane was still where Alistair had left him, slumped against the banister. But as Alistair approached, he noticed a change. Thomas was not merely defeated. His eyes had a manic, wild gleam, and his mouth was moving silently. "Mr. Crane, I have the sack, the lock." "I know what you did," Alistair stated, dropping the sack with a sickening thud onto the polished wooden floor. Thomas slowly lifted his head, a terrifying smile spreading across his face. "The connections, Doctor. You found the connections. The whole house is a web, and I am the center." "You are a murderer and a tormentor," Alistair countered. "You locked your daughter away for 15 years, not because she was insane, but because you manipulated her guilt over a child's mistake, tripping Clara. You used her own conscience as a lock." Thomas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that turned Alistair's stomach. "The room was the key, Doctor. It was her safe place. She was afraid of the world, of the sun, of the police, of the shame. She chose the room over the consequences. She chose the room because you constantly fed her terror." Alistair shouted, his professional composure finally cracking. "The scratching noise she hears is the sound of her own guilt, a perpetual reminder of what's buried beneath her." Thomas's eyes darted toward the ground floor room where Lydia Crane lay silent. "The guilt is strong, Doctor. Strong enough to kill." Alistair turned, a new chill running down his spine. "Lydia, what have you done?" "Nothing, Doctor," Thomas said, his smile widening. "The weight of the house, the guilt, the secret. It's too heavy for a broken woman. She paid her debt." Alistair ran to Lydia Crane's room, throwing open the heavy door. The room was dark, the air stale. Lydia Crane was still in the bed, but her stillness was now absolute. She lay exactly as before, but her open eyes were dull, unfocused. Alistair rushed to her side. No pulse, no breath. She had died in the overwhelming silence of the manor, unable to bear the truth any longer. The weight of the lie had finally crushed her, just as Alistair was on the cusp of exposing it. He looked back at Thomas, a man who had not killed his wife directly, but had orchestrated her death through 15 years of relentless psychological terror. "Now, the final witness, Doctor," Thomas whispered, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying final focus. Alistair's mind raced. He had to get Elizabeth out. She was the last survivor of this sick, isolated tragedy. He ran back upstairs to her room. Elizabeth was standing by the door, having moved from her corner. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, lucid, and utterly free of the panic she had shown earlier. She held the small, tarnished brass key in her hand, the key she had given Alistair and which he had returned to her. "The noise stopped," she said, her voice flat. "Mama is quiet now. The house is lighter." Alistair moved toward her, his voice urgent. "Elizabeth, we are leaving. Your mother has passed away. We are going to the authorities. We are going to tell the truth." She smiled, a small, unsettling smile that did not touch her eyes. "The truth? The truth is that Thomas is a monster, but the lie is that I was only the witness." She raised the small brass key, not the key to the padlock, but another, smaller, nearly identical key Alistair hadn't noticed. She pointed it at the high, barred window. "He taught me the connections, Doctor. The crime was debt. The debt was land. The land was the house. And the key to my little room, was the key to his freedom." Elizabeth walked to the far wall, where a single old framed engraving of the manor was hanging askew. She carefully lifted the picture and inserted the small key into a nearly invisible lock beneath the picture frame. With a heavy, grinding click, a portion of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, concealed safe built deep into the brickwork. It was old, dusty, and completely out of sight. Alistair stared. This was the final layer of Thomas Crane's complex, years-long deception. The room was not just a prison. It was a vault. Elizabeth opened the heavy safe door. Inside, there was a single, small, leather-bound document. The deed of the Crane Manor. "Thomas told me where it was, Doctor," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the deed. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was the only one who could claim the land, the only one who knew the lock, the only one who could save the name." She wasn't locked in as a witness. She was locked in as the heir and sole custodian of the secret and the property. Thomas Crane had ensured his daughter would not be able to leave the house, lest the deed be exposed, and the property claimed by the creditors. Her mental anguish had been his final terrifying security measure. Alistair looked at the lucid, chillingly composed woman, the one who had maintained her sanity in the face of absolute trauma. Her survival was not a triumph of the spirit, but a horrifying testament to the depth of her father's manipulation. She had kept her sanity because she was now the keeper of the most vital secret, the key to the family's survival. "The police, Elizabeth. The truth will set you free," Alistair pleaded. She looked at him, and her smile faded entirely. "No, Doctor. The truth sets Thomas free. The only thing that sets me free is the silence." And with a sudden, impossible burst of strength, she slammed the heavy steel door of the safe, grabbed the iron bolt from the inside, and with the quickness born of 15 years of habit, slammed the hidden wall shut, locking herself in the room once again. This time, there was no key on the outside. Alistair was trapped in the hallway, staring at the perfectly innocent wall and the askew picture frame. The final witness had secured herself in the vault, taking the ultimate secret of the Crane Manor with her. Alistair Finch hammered frantically on the hidden panel, yelling Elizabeth's name. The wall was thick, solid stone, covered with a thin layer of plaster and wallpaper. There was no response from inside. Elizabeth, the one survivor he had hoped to save, had chosen to re-imprison herself, locking the most crucial evidence, the deed and her own testimony, inside the walls of the Crane Manor. He rushed downstairs, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and frustration. Thomas Crane was still bound to the banister, watching the staircase with an expression of serene, terrible satisfaction. "You knew," Alistair breathed, stumbling to a stop. "You knew she would do this. You trained her for this moment." Thomas simply nodded, his eyes shining. "The survival of the name, Doctor. It is the strongest compulsion. She is a Crane." She understood. The world could have the life, but not the land. The land is the true witness. It never forgets the dead. Alistair grabbed the sack of evidence and the miniature diary. The police and the courts would need a body and irrefutable proof, which he now had. The truth of the murder was secured, but the deeper, more horrifying truth of Elizabeth's psychological state was locked away forever. He took a deep breath, fighting to regain his professional composure. He had failed to save Elizabeth from the mental prison, but he could still deliver justice for Elias and Clara. "You have won nothing, Mr. Crane. I have the diary, I have the murder weapon, and I have the evidence of Elias beneath your floor. You will hang," Alistair stated, his voice ringing in the cavernous foyer. Thomas looked at the sack, then back at the door leading to the garden. "The Delta is a wide place, Doctor, and justice here is thin, like the soil. They'll search. They won't find Clara. They won't find the truth of the land." Alistair turned and walked to the front door, the heavy sack of evidence in his hand. He hesitated only a moment, looking back at the defeated Thomas Crane. The man was a monster, but his final act of securing the heir was a masterpiece of pathological control. Alistair stepped out onto the veranda. The sun was hot and blinding, the air thick with humidity. He paused, adjusting his spectacles, the familiar, comforting weight of the scientific world grounding him. As he began to walk toward the main road, he heard a final, chilling sound from the house. It was not a scream or a cry of desperation. It was a single, rhythmic, dull thud. It came from Thomas Crane's direction downstairs. Alistair turned and ran back, rushing through the foyer. Thomas Crane had somehow managed to get to his feet despite the restraints. He was standing, facing the wall, his back to Alistair. The heavy brass chain used to restrain him was stretched taut. "Mr. Crane?" Thomas didn't respond. The chain was secured to the heavy wooden banister with a heavy brass lock. Thomas had twisted his hands and the chain, bracing himself against the wall. Alistair rushed forward. Thomas Crane had used the sheer weight of his body and the strength of his madness to snap the old, decaying mahogany banister itself. The heavy, dark wood had splintered violently, and a sharp, thick shard of the banister, jagged and pointed, had been driven directly into Thomas Crane's neck. The old lock, the very twin of the lock that secured his daughter's cage, now secured his end. The sudden, violent movement of the body against the chain causing the fatal impalement. Thomas Crane did not fall. He remained upright, held suspended by the chain attached to the wall, his eyes open, staring blankly at the empty space above the destroyed banister. Alistair Finch stood still in the ruined foyer, the silence returning, this time absolute and final. The master of the house had executed his own gruesome sentence, using the very instruments of his imprisonment and lies to achieve his final twisted control over the narrative. In the manor, the mother was dead by silent sorrow. The father was dead by self-inflicted violence. And the daughter, Elizabeth, the one truly innocent witness turned victim, was once again locked away, this time by her own choosing. The final, living monument to the tragedy. Alistair looked from the horrifying sight of Thomas to the heavy cedar door upstairs. He was now the only one left outside the walls of the Crane Manor who knew the entire sickening truth. He had the diary and the evidence, but the one person who could truly connect the narrative was now permanently sealed in a vault of her own making, holding the deed to the land and the last key to her sanity. Alistair finally turned his back on the house, walking away into the Delta sun. He carried the evidence of a double murder and years of psychological torment. But as he looked back at the grand, decaying facade, he knew one thing. Elizabeth Crane had not been saved. She had simply become the last lock on the door of the horrifying case, a lock twisted and forged by human cruelty which would never be undone. The true terror was not in what Thomas Crane had done, but in the chilling, absolute silence that Elizabeth Crane had finally earned. The Crane Manor stood, silent and eternal, holding the debt, the land, the dead, and the living witness, forever entombed in her own mind. The terror had ended, not with justice, but with the terrifying perfection of a broken family's final silence.